Hello, I'm Maria Minić, and I'm an architect, and I've just started my PhD here at Kingston University a few months ago. And my research looks at the housing affordability crisis, which is affecting cities across the world, and which you probably all have experienced in one way or the other. And the aim of my research is to test whether citizen-led alternatives to the real estate market can have a wide-scale impact to the crisis. And my focus is on the city of Belgrade in Serbia and on emerging solutions that are emerging there. So today, in this talk, I will focus on the transition of housing from home to commodity, which is seen as being at the heart of the current housing crisis by a body of contemporary thinkers who are building on Marxism and on the application of Marxism to urban space made by Lefebvre in the 60s. And I will propose Belgrade as a possible testing ground for those frameworks. So to briefly define what is the commodification of housing, it is when the use value of a residential building is subordinated to its exchange value. And to get an idea of the scale of this phenomena, 60% of world's assets are in real estate, with 75% of those being in housing, which means that a large part of housing of world's assets are actually in housing. So following the 2008 financial collapse, many authors have engaged with the idea of the commodification and the financialization of housing as being one of the core causes of the crisis. And Madden and Marcuse, who studied the US and the UK context, they see the housing crisis as a structural issue of the capitalist system working as intended rather than a problem of the system not working. And they identify three factors that constitute the commodification. So first, the regulation, which means the removal of restrictions on housing as a commodity. Second, financialization of housing through mortgage systems. And third, globalization, which means housing being fixed in a place dominated by global economic networks. So they, together with Samuel Stein, who also focused on the US and particularly on New York City, they argue that governments have had an active role in supporting this transition from home to commodity. And Stein identifies a number of state-implemented strategies that were adopted starting from the 70s and the 80s, not only in the USA, but also here in the UK and in many other Western countries. For example, the privatization of public housing, the dismantling of housing welfare systems, and the promotion of home ownership as the only form of tenure. So now, if those policies were first adopted in the UK and the USA, Raquel Rolnik, who's a Brazilian urbanist and who was the UN Special Rapporteur for Housing, she explained how those policies were then exported to the rest of the world with the support of international institutions such as the World Bank. And she argued that the entry of housing from very different countries in global financial circuits resulted in the fact that they all experienced in a different manner, but they all experienced consequences of the 2008 crisis. So that's why we can talk about a global housing crisis. Now, all of the thinkers has observed a number of consequences of the commodification of housing, both on urban environments, but also on the way people can access urban life. So, for example, they talk about displacement, geographical inequalities, the creation of enclaves in the city for the wealthy and the tourists, but also about, more importantly, about a general loss of the right to the city, which is also due to the fact that the commodification of housing is only one part of a much wider commodification of urban space. So how can we revert this transition? So those thinkers look at the vulnerabilities of the capitalist housing system. So Stein identifies one first major vulnerability in the fact that all capital investment has as a premise the rise in real estate prices. So anything that undermines this rise challenges the system itself. And then a second A second vulnerability identified by Madden and Marcuse in the same existence of the inhabitants. And so they see the city dweller as a new political subject with a potential collective power. So this was to give you a brief overview of this specific line of thought. And in 2021, Samuel Stein was invited to talk about his work on housing and real estate based in New York. And he was invited to talk about it in Serbia in a forum organized by Ministarstvo prostora, who is the collective that is which I'm collaborating with during my PhD. And this visit is perfectly inserted in a larger debate on the applicability of lessons learned from Western cities to the global South and the peripheries of the global North. And what emerged with the discussion with the audience in this case, which was local actors from the Southern Europe and Southern Eastern Europe, all engaged in housing and urban issues. And what emerged was that forms of resistance to the, let's say, global patterns have to be informed by local context. But although there are some let's say, phenomena that appear in a similar way in very different cities. So in my research, I look at Belgrade, and I would like to propose it as a possible testing ground for those theoretical frameworks, but also I look at it as a city to be approached in a very open way in order to see if there is something that we can learn from its specific experiences and forms of resistance. So you may wonder why Belgrade? And if we think about the Marxist historic imperative of the progression from capitalism to socialism to communism, Belgrade becomes an interesting case because it has already been through a form of state socialism, and thus it calls for a slightly different perspective. So in Belgrade and in Serbia, housing went from being a common good to becoming a personal responsibility in about 30 years. Since the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the transition to a democracy. And after the Second World War, the Yugoslavian socialist model was built around two main principles, the one of worker self-management and of societal property, which made the Yugoslav socialist system very different from centralized Soviet state systems. And just to explain briefly, workers' self-management meant that workers were actually engaged in the management of their companies where they were working, and also those companies were had the role of providing housing for workers and for the major part of the society. So housing was recognized as a right and a societal responsibility by law. And in the 60s, it became at the center of the political program of Yugoslavia, which is very well embedded in the building of New Belgrade as the new Yugoslav modern capital, which you can see in the picture. This was very much a residential city. Now, with the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the 80s and the 90s, and with economic liberalization, almost the entire housing stock was privatized, and housing transitioned to being a personal responsibility. And if other cities from ex-Yugoslavia, or they almost immediately started a process of integration into global market economy and the European Union soon after the fall of previous political systems. Belgrade and Serbia were put under embargo and isolated from international networks for about a decade, between the 1990s and the 2000s. And that resulted in two parallel phenomena. On one side, informalization, both of the market and of construction, and on the other side, hyperliberalization, which were also very much connected, I will try to explain. So in the 90s, informal self-construction was the only housing solutions for many people who migrated from regions from ex-Yugoslavia, but also from Europe, where they were often working. So they migrated back in Belgrade, and since there was no housing provision by the state and there was not a real estate market yet, the only solution for them was to build houses on their own. And this was also possible because they had many people were already working in construction industries in Europe. So when they came back, they had the knowledge how to actually build those houses, and they would do this during the weekends, also with the help of family and friends. And you can see that on this map shows that almost 40% of Belgrade residential buildings were built informally in this period. So now, when the state tried to stop this phenomena, the new laws had the effect of discouraging self-construction by ordinary people, but in a system that was corrupted at all levels of administration, the informal was taken over by the elite and businesses, and it became a negotiation practice between investors and administration. And the success of this negotiation depended on the political power or the monetary power of the investors. So as Dubravka Sekulic argued, this signed the marriage between informality and neoliberal urban policies, and these practices still persist today. You can see some informal buildings that were built for the aim of selling apartments. So investors building illegally and then selling apartments to people, which is the first, let's say, speculative form of informal construction. And then on the right, it's a huge project, which is called the Belgrade Waterfront, which is being built in a very untransparent way, and which has in itself some of those informal practices at a much larger scale. So today, the government has assumed a role of an investment facilitator and is often selling public land for the purpose of investors to make profit. And the only housing form that is promoted is homeownership. And at the same time, there are very weak social housing policies. And all of those neoliberal policies resulted in a lack of affordable housing. And in this context, I look at two main forms of resistance that emerged in Belgrade. So on one side, I look at informality during its first phase of development in the 90s as being an answer to housing needs and also a way for people to directly participate in the building of their city. And they question what is, if there is a future potential of this practice. And on the other hand, I look at how civil society is organizing and networking in order to promote alternative housing models. So to go back to Madden, Marcuse, Stein, and the others, they all argue for a contradiction in housing as a commodity, because it is, first of all, a universal and a primary necessity, and it cannot depend on someone's ability to pay. And building on this contradiction, but also on the wider meaning of home, I argue for the necessity to look at the housing crisis through the point of view of the inhabitants. And I think that we need to go beyond the simplifying dichotomy of use value versus exchange value and to look at the lived experiences of inhabiting if we want to fully understand the impact and the consequences that the commodification of housing has both on home and its dwellers. So in my research, I will use participatory methods and work in collaboration with the local partner, Ministerstvo Prostora. And the aim of my future research is to study Belgrade housing processes and to see whether there are, as I said, lessons to be learned from its specific forms of resistance, but also, and I think this is something that Raoul managed to do very well, to transform my research in a platform that can strengthen the dialogue between inhabitants, civil society, and academia, so to have an impact and not only be a work on its own. So thank you for listening, and maybe we can open up for discussion.
Thank you very much.